All right, let's just dive right in, shall we? Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are unpacking the absolutely fascinating and, honestly, highly impactful world of clinical genetics. We're going to look at exactly how genetic counselors act as guides, helping families navigate the really complex maze of hereditary diseases. And the main tool they use to do this? A beautifully complex, deeply personal map known as the Pedigree. If you've ever wondered how doctors predict genetic risks or how families even begin to make sense of a complex genetic diagnosis, well, you are in the perfect place.
Here is our roadmap for today. We'll quickly cover what genetic counseling actually is, walk through the step-by-step process, decode that pedigree, figure out recurrence risks, look at the molecular tools they use, and finally, bring it all back to the human element. So let's start right at the beginning with part 1. What exactly does a genetic counselor do? Now, the crucial thing to grasp here is that clinical genetics isn't just about crunching numbers in some sterile lab. It's formally defined as the diagnosis and management of the medical, social, and psychological aspects of hereditary disease. It's the whole shebang, a totally holistic approach. When a family suspects a hereditary disorder, it is absolutely essential to not just hand over a diagnosis, but to actually help them understand it and cope with it. And this quote really hits the nail on the head. Counseling is a collaborative process of exploration. It's not about dictating choices. The counselor is there to help families figure out their options, but they aren't going to say, hey, you should do this. In the field, this is called non-directive counseling. It's all about empowering the family to make choices that align with their own personal ethics, their religious beliefs, and their goals. Moving right along to part 2, the genetic counseling process. Let's see how this actually works in practice. Okay, so genetic counselors generally follow 4 vital steps. First up, they gather a ton of info. We're talking deep family history, medical records, ethnic backgrounds, you name it. Then comes the assessment phase. This means physical exams and lab tests to lock in a clinical diagnosis. All that data from steps 1 and 2, that's the raw material they use to build an accurate pedigree and actually calculate the risks in step 3. And finally, step 4. They assist with decision-making and offer psychosocial support. They literally act as the bridge between diagnostic labs, the doctors, and the family. You might be wondering, who actually needs this kind of guidance? Well, families usually reach out for a few common reasons. Maybe they've had a previous child with multiple congenital anomalies, or an isolated issue like a cleft lip. Or maybe there's a known family history of a condition like cystic fibrosis. Other major reasons include advanced maternal age, repeated pregnancy loss, or consanguinity, which is basically a medical term for when the parents are blood relatives, like first cousins. All right, let's get into the really cool stuff. Part 3, decoding the pedigree. Let's crack the code on this map. In a standard pedigree, squares represent males and circles represent females. Simple enough, right? A solid filled-in shape means that person actually has the condition. But the real detective work, that's finding the carriers. Those are the shapes with a little dot right in the middle. Counselors use these intricate family lines to figure out the exact probability of someone being a carrier for an autosomal recessive trait. By mapping out the math, like seeing a 1/2 or 1/4 probability, they can literally trace hidden genetics across generations. But what happens if the trait doesn't follow a neat, simple, single-gene path? For complex, multifactorial conditions, like spina bifida, counselors use the pedigree to calculate what's called an empirical risk. If a family already has one child with spina bifida, the counselor relies on historical population data to predict that the next child has about a 4% recurrence risk. Now, if we were looking at Down syndrome, that empirical risk would be about 1%. Unless a parent happens to carry a specific chromosomal translocation, that would totally change the math. Now, look at how wildly these scenarios can contrast. The recurrence risk completely shifts depending on how thorough the pedigree is. If both parents are confirmed carriers on the map, the risk for their next pregnancy, usually drawn as a diamond when the gender isn't specified, is a straightforward 1 in 4. But if the second partner's genetic makeup is a total mystery, the counselor has to rely on general population averages to guess. Suddenly, that 1 in 4 risk plummets down to 1 in 88 or even 1 in 476. And that right there is exactly why building a deeply detailed, complete family pedigree is an absolute game changer for accurate risk management. Let's dig into those numbers a bit more in part 4, determining recurrence risks. As we just saw, the easiest risk estimates happen when we actually know the genotypes. If both parents are known heterozygous carriers of an autosomal recessive condition, there's exactly a 1 in 4 chance, so 25%, that a child will inherit 2 mutant alleles and actually have the disease. But here's the kicker. that 1 in 4 chance, it resets with every single pregnancy. It's just like flipping a coin. It is absolutely not a cumulative guarantee, and that's a huge misconception counselors constantly have to clear up.
Things definitely get messier with complex traits, though. Take neural tube defects. They occur in about 0.3% of births in the general U.S. white population. But here is where drawing out that pedigree is worth its weight in gold. If a couple already has one affected child, the risk for their next pregnancy shoots up to 4%. Stop and think about that for a second. That is literally 13 times higher than the general population.
And the stakes get even more striking when you factor in gender. For example, the sister of a girl with a neural tube defect actually has a 6% chance of also having the defect. This kind of variance perfectly highlights why a counselor's precise, mathematically sound risk assessment is absolutely crucial for families trying to plan their futures.
Moving on to Part 5, Tools of Molecular Genetics. To make those pedigrees as hyper-accurate as possible, counselors don't just rely on family history anymore. They turn to DNA analysis. And there are 2 main approaches used today. First, direct detection, where scientists look straight into the genomic DNA for the exact mutation. The second method comes into play when the exact mutation is, well, hiding. It's called using linked markers, which basically means indirectly tracking the genetic neighborhood, the markers flanking the disease locus. When direct detection works, it is incredibly powerful. For Duchenne muscular dystrophy, direct detection can spot specific gene deletions in about 60% of patients, and duplications in another 6%. Or take cystic fibrosis. For CF, direct detection has to sift through over 1,000 different described mutations. Some are super common, depending on your ethnic group, while others have only been found in a tiny handful of families worldwide. It's literally like finding a microscopic needle in a genomic haystack.
But what if you literally can't find the exact mutation? That's when linked markers come to the rescue. For this indirect tracking to work, though, the stars kind of have to align perfectly. Counselors need an informative family, meaning they need key family members available to study who actually have these heterozygous markers. And, crucially, they have to be totally sure no recombination has happened between the markers and the disease gene. Because if the DNA got mixed up between generations, the whole map becomes inaccurate.
All right, let's wrap things up with Part 6, the human element. Let's zoom out from the microscopic DNA and the math for a second. The most crucial point to remember here is that while lab tests can sometimes give a huge sigh of relief to couples, prenatal diagnosis is absolutely not a magical, universal fix. Genetics can hand us probabilities, and it can pinpoint molecular deletions, but it doesn't hand us a crystal ball, and it definitely doesn't solve the agonizing decisions a family might have to make. Because behind every single circle, square, dot, and diamond on that pedigree map is a real family. These are people dealing with the looming risk of a genetic disorder or trying to cope with the illness itself. It brings on immense emotional and social stress. That is exactly why they are called counselors. This isn't just a quick one-and-done meeting. It's an ongoing relationship that demands serious psychosocial support. Sometimes the weight of it all is so heavy that the counselor will refer the family for dedicated psychotherapy. So as we close out today's explainer, I want you to consider this. In a world of mind-blowing DNA analysis, where we can map out 1,000 different mutations and crunch recurrence risks down to the fraction of a percent, how do we ensure the profound emotional journey of the family stays just as prioritized as the clinical math? As our genetic maps get flawlessly precise, the ultimate challenge isn't just decoding the pedigree anymore. It's figuring out how to navigate the deeply human consequences of what we uncover there. Thanks so much for learning with us today.